used to think the worst thing in a marriage was betrayal. But no, my husband treated me like a pawn, something he could wager and lose in a game of chance. When I was handed over to another man, everything inside me died. You won't be able to take your eyes off the surprises that are about to unfold. If I lose, my wife is yours for a day. Dare to take the bet? That sentence was spoken amid loud laughter, in a room filled with cigarette smoke and dim basement casino lights, where all moral values became blurry under the haze of alcohol and primal desire. To the men sitting around that poker table that night, it was just a joke, something to spice up the atmosphere after hours of play. But to me, the woman mentioned in that sentence, it was the death knell for a marriage long dead, one I was still desperately trying to keep alive. Adam, my husband, was too familiar with the feeling of superiority. Confident, arrogant, always speaking as if the world revolved around his inflated ego. He used to be the kind of man others admired, successful, handsome, articulate, and seemingly generous. But behind the polished exterior was an empty man, addicted to validation, hooked on winning like a drug, not winning in business but in meaningless bets, places where he could feel like the king. And that night, when luck no longer favored him, when the money ran out, and his pride was crumbling piece by piece, Adam needed one last bet, something valuable yet dispensable, something he could throw on the table without a second thought. He chose me. He placed me on the table like his final poker chip. Adam pulled an old photo from his wallet, our wedding photo, where I smiled in his arms, eyes shining with the belief I was the luckiest woman alive. He placed it on the table, among cards and chips, as if putting down something he'd already used up. No one objected. None of the men sitting there looked disturbed. Some burst into laughter, patting each other's backs like this was the height of humor. Others even cheered, egging on whoever had the guts to take the challenge. And then Marcus spoke, a stranger, quiet. He didn't bring the rowdy air of a drunk, nor did he show contempt like the others. His eyes were calm, without excitement or anger, just a prolonged silence, as if listening to the final beats of something once sacred. He looked at Adam, then gave a slight nod. "All right," he said, not another word. Cards were dealt. Cards were revealed. Frowns, trembling fingers, and finally, Adam's sigh, as he realized he'd lost completely. Lost it all. The money, his pride, and the woman who once loved him with everything she had. Adam clapped and laughed loudly after losing, then leaned back in his chair, saying indifferently, "She's yours now, one day. Do whatever you want." When Marcus showed up at my door that evening, I was shocked and chilled to the bone, overwhelmed by a strong sense that something was terribly wrong. He spoke, and his words still make me shiver. "Your husband bet you in a poker game, and I won." I don't remember what I felt at that moment. No scream, no tears, just a cold emptiness beyond definition. I had lived with Adam for 5 years, long enough to forget what it felt like to be looked at with respect. I had become used to living in his shadow, where I always had to be gentle, always in the right place at the right time, always silent when he was angry and smiling when he needed to show off his wife to his friends. But I never thought he could do this. I had been too naive. I used to think that even if he stopped loving me, he'd at least have some pride. That there were lines a man simply wouldn't cross, just because they were the thin border between being human and being a beast. But Adam crossed that line as if it never existed. He gambled me like a toy, like one last try at luck. Just one sentence. No more, no less. No showiness, no arrogance. But to me, that sentence felt like a final indictment. Not against Marcus, but against Adam, and against myself, for staying too long in a marriage without love, without respect. Adam was in the living room when I walked out. He said nothing, didn't ask where I was going, didn't stop me, just glanced at Marcus, shrugged, and said, "Do whatever you want with her. Come on, Evelyn, it's just one day. Don't overreact." that was the last time I saw Adam as a husband. From that moment on, he became nothing but a scar, a reminder of the total collapse of trust and dignity. I walked out of the apartment in simple clothes, bringing nothing but my phone and wallet. I didn't say a word. I didn't ask where Marcus was taking me. I only knew one thing. If I stayed, I would wither away and die. Die in silence, in contempt, in the feeling of no longer being human. I didn't know what lay ahead, but I knew one thing. I had just stepped out of the darkness, and maybe, for the first time in a long time, I was truly alive. I didn't sleep all night. Though exhausted, my body stayed in a state of heightened alert. Everything was so quiet it felt eerie. No heavy footsteps, no clattering dishes, no male voice yelling behind a door. I lay there in a strange room, unlocked, unwatched, and for the first time in years, I was allowed a night without worrying about someone's expression. Morning light crept through the window, casting a glow on the pale gray wall. I heard faint sounds from the kitchen, calm, unrushed, without irritation. The scent of toasted bread and black tea slowly filled the space. I sat up and stepped out of the living room where Marcus had let me stay last night, my hands still trembling slightly from an anxiety that hadn't yet left me. Marcus's home wasn't big, but it was strangely clean. Everything was arranged with such order, it felt like I had stepped into a parallel world, where the chaos of my recent life never existed. No blaring TV. No shirts tossed on chairs, no cigarette smoke clinging to the walls, just soft light and shelves lined with old books. A silence so deep I almost didn't trust it. Marcus stood with his back to me, holding a pan. He wore a rolled-up shirt, tall and lean, but strong. He didn't say anything when I entered the kitchen, just tilted his head slightly, signaling he knew I was up. "I'm making breakfast. Sunny-side eggs, toast, black tea. If you want something else, just say," he said evenly and gently, like he was speaking to a guest, not to a woman who had been wagered away in a card game. I didn't respond right away. I just stood there, observing, feeling. I searched for signs of something familiar, a controlling gaze, a possessive gesture, a loaded comment like I'd grown so used to with Adam. But Marcus wasn't like that. He didn't rush to look at me, didn't probe, didn't trigger any of my defensive reflexes. He let me be who I was, a person with wounds, untouchable without consent. He placed the tea in front of me when I sat down. Didn't ask if I wanted it. Didn't expect thanks. And that, more than anything, made me speak. "You don't have to do this," I said, my voice hoarse from the long night. Marcus looked up. His eyes weren't sharp or cold, but something in them made me feel seen. Not my body, but the chaotic layers of emotion I'd tried to bury. "I know," he replied calmly. "I'm not doing it to get anything in return. I don't want you to feel pressured, but if you want to leave, I won't stop you." I stayed quiet. His words were simple, straightforward. No seductive undertone, no attempt to prove he was different from the man who bet me away the night before. And because of that, he truly was different. I took a sip of tea. The bitterness touched my tongue, then settled into a warm aftertaste in my throat. I couldn't remember the last time I sat like this. A quiet breakfast, no phones ringing, no harsh words, no feeling like I was living on a battlefield. I looked around the kitchen. Every detail bore the mark of a thoughtful soul. Neatly stacked cookbooks, a small cactus on the windowsill, and a folded handkerchief on the table. In this house, I saw something my old home never had. Kindness, unspoken, unforced. "Aren't you curious?" I asked. "About me?" "About last night." Marcus looked at me again, this time longer. Then he answered, "Curiosity is instinct, but respect is a choice. I choose the latter." I didn't know how to respond. For the first time in years, I met a man who didn't want to possess me, define me by a role: wife, lover, pawn, or debt. He simply saw me as a person, wounded, yes, but a person, and allowed me to exist in that woundedness without asking me to hide it. We ate breakfast in silence, but it wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was the kind of silence that allowed me to hear my own heartbeat, something I hadn't felt in a very long time. After breakfast, Marcus cleaned up. I stood by the sink, watching him work carefully, neither lazy nor loud. He lived alone, I guessed, and he was used to independence. It showed in every small act. "Can I help?" I asked, almost out of habit. But I wasn't sure why I offered. Maybe I wanted to contribute. Maybe I didn't want to be passive like I had been with Adam. Marcus nodded, said nothing. We washed the dishes together. My hands still trembled slightly, but he didn't comment. He didn't ask about Adam, or the marriage, or the poker game. And his silence made me want to speak. I said nothing that morning, but in Marcus's gaze, I found an answer I had never dared to ask myself. Do I deserve to be treated kindly? And in that moment, I knew one thing. For the first time in many years, I met a man who didn't see me as a possession. He saw me as a person, and that changed everything. We left the apartment close to noon, without a word spoken, just as the sunlight began to stream through the windows, illuminating the dust in the air. I stood up to grab my jacket. Marcus looked at me, then reached for the keys on the table. He didn't ask where I wanted to go, and I didn't need to explain. Between us, a kind of unspoken language was beginning to form. A feeling that we could exist beside each other without needing to control one another. We walked to a small park at the end of the street, a quiet place, not too crowded, with tall trees and old cobblestone paths. On the benches along the way, some elderly people were sitting reading books. Children played ball under the sun. The occasional chirping of birds seemed to remind us that there was still another world out there, a world unaware of pain and disappointment. I walked slowly. Marcus didn't hurry either. We walked side by side like two strangers unintentionally going in the same direction. That feeling, to me, was both unfamiliar and familiar. I had walked beside Adam many times before, but back then, I always had to rush to keep up with him. I had to listen to him talk about work, about his friends, about other women he never named, but I always knew. I was never allowed to be silent while walking beside my husband. But now, I was allowed to be silent completely. We stopped by a large tree. Marcus pointed to a wooden bench, signaling me to sit down. He didn't speak for a long while. He just stared off into the distance at the children playing. I glanced at him from the corner of my eye. His face wasn't exactly handsome, but there was something very distinct about it. Not coldness, but a lived experience. That experience didn't come with bitterness, but with the calm of someone who had lost much and chose to keep living. After a while, he spoke. "I had a wife," he said, his voice even and slow, as if carefully placing each word on the ground, afraid it might break. "We met in college. I loved her completely. No calculations, no holding back. I used to think love was about giving everything until I was left alone." I didn't say anything, but his story struck me like a heavy, silent echo. I looked down at my hands that had grown used to shielding themselves when there was a loud noise, to pulling back when someone got angry, to gripping tightly whenever I was dragged out of a fight I never won. Marcus didn't look at me when he continued. Perhaps he didn't need to look to know I was listening. She said I was too good, that I didn't deserve someone like her. But kind words couldn't ease the feeling of being replaced, especially when the one replacing me was my best friend. I looked up. For the first time that day, I caught a glimpse of a quiet pain in his eyes, like a crack on the calm surface of a lake. It wasn't clear, but it was real. "Do you hate her?" I asked, hesitating. Marcus was silent for a moment, then shook his head. "No, it's just after that. I stopped believing in things that were too beautiful, and I stopped believing that love had to be exchanged for losing yourself." I lowered my face. A chill ran down my spine, even though the weather wasn't cold. Every word he said felt like a mirror reflecting what I had lived for so many years. I had given up myself, little by little. From the first time Adam raised his voice and I stayed silent. From the first time I saw his messages with another girl and chose not to ask. From the first time I cried in the bathroom so he wouldn't see. and wouldn't get angry because I was weak. I used to think it was sacrifice. Now I know it was loss, the greatest loss of my life. A gentle breeze blew by. I pulled my sleeves up higher to keep warm. Marcus glanced at my hand, then stopped. There was an old bruise on my wrist. The purple blue had faded, but it was still visible enough to show it wasn't an accidental injury. I saw him look at it, but he didn't ask, didn't touch it, didn't change his expression. He just looked for a moment, then turned away, as if he knew. I didn't need pity, just someone who would stay quietly. I started crying, not because of that bruise, but because of all the times I had cried without anyone knowing. For the times I wanted to leave but didn't have the courage. For the times I wanted to scream, "I am human too," but my throat was choked by the fear of being abandoned. I cried, not because Marcus had said something special, but because in his eyes, I didn't see judgment. I didn't see probing. I didn't see contempt. I saw a place, small, fragile, but enough for me to rest my weary feet after years of running after a fake love. I turned to him, my voice almost inaudible. "I don't want to go back anymore." Marcus didn't react. He just looked at me for a long time. And in the silence between the two of us, I heard something very real. Freedom. That afternoon, I decided to return to the old apartment. Not because I wanted to see Adam, not because there was any lingering attachment to the so-called home. I just needed to pack a few personal items, things I once thought were tied to married life. But now, looking back, were just fake pieces in a puzzle I never got to choose the colors for. I informed Marcus that I wanted to go back and get my things. He didn't ask why, didn't offer to go with me. He just left a spare key and told me to let myself be alone if I needed to. His quiet kindness made me feel even more confused. I wasn't used to being allowed to make decisions without being controlled. Before, every action of mine had to be approved by Adam. Even visiting my mother required a nod. I stood in front of the familiar door, the one I used to walk through with dreams, and now could only walk out of with scars. The fingerprint lock that Adam installed because he didn't like anyone else touching his door was still there. I touched it, and the door opened smoothly, as if it still recognized me, even though its owner did not. The apartment was quiet. I guessed Adam wasn't home. The living room light was still on, his clothes draped over the sofa, shoes hastily thrown on the floor. It was still the usual messy scene, but now I saw it with different eyes. No longer was it the familiarity of my husband's usual stuff, but a clear sign that this was never where I belonged. I went into the bedroom, opened the closet, and grabbed a small suitcase. I started packing clothes, the outfits Adam had picked for me, saying they were to his liking. I used to wear them to please him, to look good in his eyes, just like my mother had taught me. But now, each piece of clothing suffocated me. They weren't for me. They were for a version of myself Adam wanted me to be. Silent, gentle, obedient, and never questioning him. I left the bedroom and walked into the living room to grab my notebook, a few small things I had left on the shelf. When I bent down to pick up the fallen photo frame, Adam's phone, placed on the coffee table, lit up. I didn't mean to look, but the light of the screen happened to point directly at me, and the message content was clearly visible. "Thought you said she was just a puppet. Why haven't you gotten rid of her yet?" I froze. No need to open the phone, no need to see the rest. Just that one short sentence was enough to make my entire world inside crumble. I stood there for a long time, holding the photo frame tightly, not realizing my fingertips had gone pale. I didn't know who had sent the message, a friend, a lover, an accomplice in games I was never invited to. But that no longer mattered, because what hurt wasn't the content but the confirmation. The confirmation that in Adam's eyes, I had never been the real wife. I was just a puppet, a doll that knew how to smile when needed, knew how to stay silent when told, and knew how to obey like a habit well trained. I tried to breathe, but my throat tightened. In my mind, I replayed every word, every gesture, every cold glance I had ignored. There was a time I was sick, lying feverishly through the night, and Adam just dropped by, tossed me some cold medicine, then went to meet his friends. I used to think he wasn't used to showing affection. There was a time I wore a new dress, and he looked me up and down, saying, "Don't go out like that. People will think I'm taking a girl along." I used to think he was just joking. I had excused him hundreds of times because I needed a reason to stay, because I feared being called a failed wife. But the truth was, I had failed from the very start, because I didn't realize I wasn't loved. I placed the photo frame back on the table. Our wedding photo, the one Adam had placed as a bet the night he lost the game, now lay quietly, just as lifeless as my role in this marriage. I didn't cry, didn't scream, didn't smash anything, not because it didn't hurt, but because the pain had surpassed the point of being able to express it. It had turned into an empty space in my chest, a vacuum that swallowed all emotions, leaving me with just one state: awareness. I realized that I had wasted the best years of my life on someone who never cherished me. I realized that my sacrifices were only conditions for him to take one more step. And I realized that if I didn't leave right now, I would have nothing left to hold on to. I stood up straight, walked toward the bedroom, and pulled the suitcase toward the door. When I turned back to turn off the lights, I unconsciously looked around one last time. The apartment I had once called home now felt suffocatingly empty. I saw no signs of love here, just expensive objects, bought to show off. Perfume bottles, watches, decorations. Everything was perfect, but soulless. Just like our marriage. I walked out the door, closing it behind me. The sound of the lock clicking shut was like a final judgment. No one saw me off. No one tried to stop me, and I no longer expected that. As I walked down the stairs, the evening breeze swept through the cold corridor, carrying something from deep within my heart. Maybe regret. Maybe the last bit of an illusion that had just disappeared. I didn't look back, because I had seen enough. And from now on, I was no longer the shadow in his crazy bets. I was a person who had seen the truth and survived. I didn't return to the apartment because I was weak, nor because I wanted to see Adam again. The simple reason was that I had forgotten something irreplaceable. A small wooden box containing all my personal documents and the handwritten letters from my mother. It was already dark. As I walked into the familiar hallway, everything was eerily silent. I still remembered the door code. It had never changed, because Adam always believed he was the one in control. No one dared to leave, and even fewer dared to return in a new way. I pushed the door open. The light in the living room was still on, casting a pale and cold yellow light onto the floor. The smell of alcohol, cigarettes, and perfume mixed together like a familiar concoction I once called home. Now it made me nauseous. I walked straight into the study, but as soon as my hand touched the drawer handle, I heard laughter. Light, clear, and definitely not mine. I froze. Only moments later, footsteps echoed from the hallway leading to the bedroom. And then, she stepped out. A young woman, long hair, wearing Adam's shirt. She smiled lightly, still holding a glass of wine, her mouth about to say something before freezing when she saw me. For a moment, the air in the apartment seemed to drain away. She didn't ask me who I was. It wasn't necessary, because the look in my eyes and the look on her face said it all. I didn't know what I felt in that moment. Not anger, not jealousy, not humiliation. Just a brutal emptiness, cold like a knife cutting into my heart with no blood left to spill. Adam appeared right after, his shirt half-buttoned, his gaze confused as if he had been woken from a dream at the wrong time. "Evelyn," he stammered. For the first time in my life, I saw Adam flustered. No longer the arrogant man who used to yell that men are the pillar. No longer the husband who had pushed me out of his life with a bet. Just a man caught in the act before he could fix himself. "Why are you back?" "What for?" I didn't answer. I stood tall, my gaze unwavering. Adam looked at me, then hurriedly turned to the woman. softly ordering, "Go inside." She didn't say anything. Quietly, she walked into the bedroom and closed the door behind her. A swift, familiar motion, as if this wasn't the first time. Adam stepped toward me, his voice lower. "Listen to me. It's not what you think. She's just an old friend visiting me. We just had some drinks. There's nothing between us." I looked him directly in the eye, not backing down. "Nothing?" He nodded, as if clinging to that answer as his last lifeline. "I swear, Evelyn, I didn't mean to do anything wrong. It's just you left suddenly." I panicked. I didn't know what to do. She showed up just when I needed someone to talk to. That's all. You know me. I'm not that kind of person. I laughed, a soundless laugh. A bitter feeling rose in my throat. "Not that kind of person?" I repeated. "Then what kind of person would bet his wife on someone else in a game?" Adam fell silent. I took a step forward. My voice was calm, but every word felt like a clear line drawn between us, unbreakable. "You placed me on the table like an object. You offered me up to feel victorious. And now you're denying it just because I caught you with another woman?" Adam lowered his head, then lifted it, trying to regain his usual tone. "I was wrong, I know, but you went with that guy, stayed at his place, and then came back to accuse me of betrayal. What about my honor?" I stood silent for a few seconds, then gently replied, "Don't bring honor into this, Adam. You burned it that night." He stepped forward, his hand reaching out like he wanted to grasp my shoulders. "We can fix this. You've forgiven me so many times. Why can't you forgive me this time? Don't ruin everything over a moment of anger." I stepped back, pushing his hand away, not roughly, but firmly enough for him to understand that the line had been drawn and would never be crossed again. "It's not about anger. It's because I've awakened." I looked at him for the last time and said with all the clarity I had long wished for in the nights full of tears, "I left not because of Marcus, not because I wanted to betray you. I left because I am no longer your bet." This time he didn't have an answer. He just stood there, his eyes bloodshot, breathing heavily, his hands clenched into fists, not out of anger toward me, but because he had lost the grip on me that he once had. I turned away. I walked out of that apartment for the last time. Nothing more to retrieve, nothing more to regret. When I returned to Marcus's apartment, he was sitting at the kitchen table, reading a book. When he saw me enter, he didn't ask anything. He just looked at me with a calm gaze. The kind of calm that only someone who's been betrayed and learned to live through it can have. I placed the bag on the table, sat down. No need to say anything more. Under the soft light, in the quiet space, I could hear the steady rhythm of my own breath. And I knew at last I had truly broken free, not from Adam, but from myself. The woman who once thought she couldn't live without the man who had gambled her away like an object. The next morning, I woke up to the soft light streaming through the window of Marcus's apartment. There was no smell of cigarettes, no heavy footsteps, no feeling of having to shrink under someone else's shadow. I woke up to my own breath, in a small room that wasn't mine, but was enough for me to begin calling it peace. But Adam wasn't ready to let go. The first call came at 9 a.m. I was making tea when my phone rang. The familiar name appeared on the screen. Adam. I didn't pick up. 15 minutes later, another call. Then 10 more. Then messages followed, as if a dam had broken after a long night of being blocked. "Evelyn, pick up. Please." I was wrong. I realize now. "You are everything to me. I can't sleep. Are you really gone? We're married. Don't make me go crazy." I sat, watching the phone screen light up and then fade again. A part of me felt pain, but the other part felt calm. For the first time, I didn't react out of fear. I didn't rush to explain, didn't write a long message to share how hurt I was. I no longer needed him to understand. My silence this time was a conscious choice. On the third day, Adam called my old workplace. I received a message from an old colleague. "Your husband came, sat outside in his car all morning. Are you okay?" I simply replied, "I'm fine, thank you." That evening, when I returned to the apartment, I found a large bouquet of white roses in front of the door, the kind I used to like. Perhaps Adam still remembered, but it was too late. I didn't open the card. It wasn't necessary, because I knew A late apology couldn't erase the image of me standing in the living room that day, facing the husband who had just pushed a young woman into the bedroom while stammering that I had misunderstood. What I needed wasn't flowers. It was respect. Something lost too long to be reclaimed with a few wilted petals at the edge. I started working again the following week. A small bookstore on the corner, open only from morning until afternoon. The job was simple: organizing books, assisting customers, making a little coffee. No one cared who I was, what I had been through. No one asked about Adam. No one looked at me with pity. There, I was just a normal person, not anyone's wife, not the woman who was betrayed. And that was worth more than any consolation. Marcus didn't ask what I did, where I went. He didn't follow me, didn't check my hours, didn't pretend to care to control me. He just opened the door every evening, brewed tea, and placed it on the kitchen table. Occasionally he asked, "How was your day?" in a tone light enough to let me know that if I didn't want to speak, I didn't have to. Once I dropped my bag in the hallway. Marcus bent down to pick it up without looking me in the face. When I said thank you, he just nodded lightly. No further words, no attempt to prolong the conversation. I had never known that a man could be present so quietly, without invading, without possessing, without demanding. That presence moved me more than any flowery words Adam had ever said after making me hurt. One day, Marcus asked me, as we were cleaning the table, "Do you want to change the door code?" I looked at him. The simple question carried so much meaning. A man who truly understood that a woman doesn't always need someone to save her, but always needs a space where she knows she's no longer being watched, controlled, or threatened. I thought for a few seconds, then shook my head. No, I think what needed to change has already changed. And it was true. What I needed to change wasn't the door code. It was how I faced myself. I didn't want to return, not because of anger, not because of Marcus, but because I had stepped out of my old role, the role of a woman living in silence, living to please, living like a shadow in her own house. I had loved Adam, but now I loved the quiet of morning spent making tea for myself. I loved the feeling of going to work and coming home without having to report to anyone. I loved my existence, not defined by a place beside a man. Adam still texted, but less and less. I didn't delete them. I left them there, like old ink stains in a notebook that had been filled. Each line a reminder to me. Forgiveness doesn't mean stepping back. I didn't look back, because I had gone far enough. 1 month after signing the divorce papers, I walked out of the courthouse with a lighter heart than ever before. Not because I had forgotten Adam, or because the pain was gone, but because for the first time in my life, I had dared to end something that hurt me, instead of continuing to live in a fantasy built by someone else. The divorce papers weren't just a farewell letter. To me, they were a certificate that I had survived. After the long days of being disrespected, after being treated like an object, after hiding bruises that only I knew how to cover up to keep the title of wife, Adam lost everything. His wife, his dignity, and the trust of friends and partners. When the story of the bet spread, no one saw him as a successful man anymore. He lost the aura of someone who knew how to win, because no one truly wins when they have to bet their wife to prove it. What he once thought was power was now just a pile of ashes. And no one applauds the one who burned someone else's heart to warm their own ego. I didn't gloat, but I didn't feel pity either. I lived in a small apartment on the outskirts, where in the early morning, birds sang near the bougainvillea, and in the late afternoon, the sun slanted through the window to illuminate the wooden table I bought from an old shop. I took care of the garden myself, cooked, and brewed tea every morning. I revisited the books I had once left on the shelf. Each time I turned a page, it felt like opening a door in my heart. A door that had once been locked by the fear of the question, what am I without a man by my side? I had found the answer. I am whole. I worked part-time at the bookstore. I went to work in the morning, went shopping in the afternoon. At night, I sat writing in my journal. No more scolding. No more being told to be gentler, speak less, or don't let others see how tired you are. No one was there, but that didn't mean I was lonely. Marcus still kept his distance. He didn't interfere with my divorce. He didn't rush anything. He only quietly appeared when I needed help moving things, or when the lights in my house went out and I hadn't had time to call a repairman. He still brought me bags of apples because he saw I used to eat a lot of them. He didn't ask, didn't impose, didn't rush me to forget and move on. He understood. Some wounds don't need someone to soothe them. They just need a place where they're allowed to heal. I once thought I didn't need men anymore. And truly, I didn't. But I realized what I didn't need wasn't a man, but someone who made me lose myself to be with them. Marcus wasn't like that. He wasn't the blazing light of a new love. He was the small table lamp, quiet, not blinding, but always there when I needed him. On the days I cried alone on the balcony, he didn't ask about it, but the next morning, he left a handwritten note outside my door. I'm not good at comforting, but I believe you are strong enough to get through this. And I did get through it. Not because of him, but because of me. But I knew, if not for his quiet presence, the journey would have been much harder. One autumn afternoon, while I was watering the small flower pots on the porch, Marcus stopped by, as usual. He handed me an old book, The Independent Woman, and said with a soft smile, I thought you'd like it, but if you don't, that's okay. I just wanted to give it to you. I took it, flipped through a few pages, then looked at him, silently asking, do you think, does someone like me start over? He didn't answer immediately. He just looked at me for a long while, then quietly said, I think you don't need to start over. You just need to keep going. But this time, with someone who doesn't make you lose yourself. I nodded. No need for promises, no need for confessions. And then, very naturally, I reached out to touch his hand, without trembling, without defensiveness. We sat there together. No need to define the relationship, no rush to establish a future. Just two people who had once fallen apart and were now learning how to trust kindness again. I didn't choose Marcus because he was a good man. I chose him because I had chosen myself again. And only after that did I see him clearly, completely, not as a lifeline, but as a companion. Because sometimes a cruel bet isn't just betrayal. It's an opening, a wake-up call, a crack for the light to seep in. And in that crack, I found my dignity, my freedom, and for the first time, a love that didn't make me lose myself. When a woman dares to step out of a place that once made her believe she was no longer worthy, what she regains is not only freedom, but the whole self that was silently traded away. Evelyn didn't choose to leave because she was weak. She chose to leave because she had become strong enough to stop living a life controlled by repeated, meaningless apologies. And perhaps many of us, whether women or men, have been in such a place where we have to bow down, endure, sacrifice, thinking that love requires that. A place where every forgiveness makes us lose a piece of ourselves to keep someone we thought was important. But there is a truth that few speak of. When love makes you lose yourself, it is no longer love. Evelyn's journey is a reminder not just for women, but for anyone who has ever asked themselves, am I living in accordance with my own value? You don't need to be bet on like Evelyn to realize the injustice. Just each time you stay silent out of fear of being abandoned, each time you forgive to maintain peace but inside you die a little, that's when you are already placing yourself outside your own limits. Don't wait until the pain becomes too deep before you leave. Don't wait for anyone to hand you your worth. Hold it from the very beginning. Remember, forgiveness doesn't mean going back. Understanding doesn't mean accepting hurt. Maturity doesn't mean staying in a place that makes you wilt. And true love never has to be paid with tears every night. In the end, Evelyn chose herself. And only when she had the courage to do that did healthy love appear. Not rushed, not dramatic, just someone who understood enough not to demand, mature enough not to control, and patient enough to wait for when she was ready. So what about you? If you were Evelyn, would you go back to the man who once saw you as a bet, just because he can say sorry? Or would you start a new journey? One that's not promised to be easy, but where you get to be yourself. Live with the dignity you've always had. Are you living in a relationship that makes you give up too much and not get anything worthy in return? Are you staying out of habit, out of fear of judgment, out of what will people say? Or are you waiting for someone to remind you that you have every right to walk away? Thank you for listening to this story until the end. If you think this story deserves to be shared, please like, subscribe, and leave a message. Because somewhere out there, another Evelyn is waiting for someone to tell her, you have the right to leave, and you're not wrong for choosing yourself.